Good morning. I hope that you guys were all very nice to your mothers yesterday and made them feel loved. I gave my mom a kite yesterday. She likes toys, so it seemed like a good present. We could go out and fly it together. We just have a couple of chapters left here. Today we've got the impudence of Mr. Snake is our first one. And impudence means like being rude, not following directions, talking back, like thinking that you don't need to follow the rules because you're better somehow. So the impudence of Mr. Snake, like he's doing something like totally out of line with what he's supposed to be doing. Johnny Chuck was going down the lone little path on his way to the sweet clover patch for his breakfast. Johnny was thinking of nothing in particular and paying no attention to anything in particular. Suddenly, he heard a gentle little hiss. Johnny Chuck stopped short right where he was. He knew that hiss well, as if he'd been looking right at the maker of it. It was the hiss of Mr. Snake. But which Mr. Snake, Johnny Chuck was not sure. If it was the hiss of little Mr. Garter Snake or Mr. Green Snake, Johnny didn't care. But if it was the hiss of Mr. Copperhead, Johnny did care. It was to make sure whose hiss at him that Johnny Chuck had stopped so short. Why do you think it would make a difference? You guys ever seen a garter snake before? Or a green snake? Not that harmless, right? Copperhead? That'll bite. It's always best to be sure and safe, said Johnny Chuck, as his sharp little eyes looked this way and that way. Just before him, curled up in the lone little path, was Mr. Green Snake. He was sticking out his tongue at Johnny Chuck and trying to make himself look very fierce. Johnny Chuck laughed. You don't suppose that I'm afraid of you, do you? He cried. Little Mr. Greensnake just hissed louder than ever and ran his tongue out at Johnny Chuck in the sauciest way. He didn't intend to move out of Johnny Chuck's way unless he had to. Johnny Chuck looked at Mr. Greensnake very hard, and Mr. Greensnake ran his tongue out again. Johnny Chuck's temper began to rise, and so did the hair of his coat, until he looked almost twice as big as he really is. Little Mr. Greensnake didn't say anything, but he made up his mind that he had a sudden and important business somewhere else, and that he might be going. So without much as begging Johnny Chuck's pardon, little Mr. Greensnake glided away through the grass, but as he went, he turned his head once more and stuck out his tongue at Johnny Chuck. Johnny Chuck trotted on down the lone little path, and, as he trotted along, he began to think out loud, I wonder what makes Mr. Greensnake so very saucy, or like rude, said he. The idea of him sticking his tongue out at me that way for nothing. But now I think of it, little Mr. Greensnake did the very same thing the last time I met him. And so did Mr. Adder, another type of snake, and Mr. Copperhead and Mr. Blacksnake. I wonder if they stick their tongues out at everybody that way, or if it's just me. They stick them out at everybody, even at us. Isn't it dreadful? Said a soft little voice right in Johnny Chuck's ear. It was one of the Merry Little Breezes of Old Mother West Wind. I don't know, said the Merry Little Breeze. I've even seen Mr. Blacksnake stick his tongue out at Farmer Brown's boy, even when Farmer Brown's boy was trying to kill him with a stick. And when finally Mr. Blacksnake ran away, he kept turning and sticking his tongue out just the same. Did you ever hear of such impudence? Johnny Chuck shook his head. I never did. I certainly never did, he said. Perhaps that is one reason why nobody likes them. I'll tell you what, let's go over to the Smiling Pool and ask Grandfather Frog if he knows why all the snake family are so impudent, cried the Merry Little Breezes. The very thing, cried the other Merry Little Breezes, who had gathered around. Grandfather Frog will be sure to know, for he is so very old and very wise. Come on, Johnny Chuck. Away raced the Merry Little Breezes across the Green Meadow to the Smiling Pool. Johnny Chuck started after them, but he is round and fat and roly-poly, and to run makes him huff and puff. Pretty soon he stopped and looked over to the Smiling Pool, and the Merry Little Breezes were already there, as Johnny Chuck could tell by the way the bulrushes were nodding. I think that sweet clover will do me more good than one of Grandfather Frog's stories, which it may or may not be true, said Johnny Chuck. Besides, the Merry Little Breezes will tell me about it if I tease them too, and then I'll have both the clover and the story. He's funny. So Johnny Chuck went on to the sweet clover patch and ate and ate and ate, while the Merry Little Breezes were busy blowing fat, foolish green flies within reach of Grandfather Frog's big mouth, for they knew that when he had enough fat, foolish green frogs inside his white and yellow waistcoat, Grandfather Frog is almost sure to feel good-natured, very, very good-natured indeed, and that is the time to beg a story. While they were hunting for fat, foolish green flies, whom should they find but Mr. Blacksnake, curled up on the bank of the Smiling Pool. Whenever they passed, he ran his tongue out at them. I wonder why they're running their tongue out at people. I don't know why snakes do that. Maybe they'll tell us in the story. I've heard theories that they're trying to, like, taste, like, what's in the air so they can sense, like, it's like what they're smelling. But I don't know if that's true or not. When Grandfather Frog said he couldn't tuck another fat, foolish green fly inside his white and yellow waistcoat to save him, the Merry Little Breezes begged him for a story. "Chug-a-rum! What shall I tell you about?" asked Grandfather Frog. The Merry Little Breezes pointed across the Smiling Pool to the bank where Mr. Blacksnake lay. "Tell us why he and all his relations stick their tongues out at all who pass," cried the Merry Little Breezes. Old Grandfather Frog lay on his big green lily pad and looked across the sunny spot on the bank of the Smiling Pool. There lay Mr. Blacksnake taking a sun bath. Every time one of the Merry Little Breezes raced by him or the Bossy the cow came near him, Mr. Blacksnake raised his head and stuck out his tongue. Yes, sir, Mr. Blacksnake would run his tongue out at everyone he passed. "Chug-a-rum," said Grandfather Frog. "That's what comes from impudence." Grandfather Frog settled himself and pulled down his white and yellow waistcoat. Then he gazed again at the sunny bank where Mr. Blacksnake lay. And somehow it seemed to the Merry Little Breezes that Grandfather Frog wasn't looking at the sunny spot on the bank or at Mr. Blacksnake at all, but was looking away, way off. And so he was. He was looking into the days when the world was young. Presently, he began to talk just as if he had forgotten all about the Merry Little Breezes and was talking to himself. The Merry Little Breezes drew close around him and settled down, for very, very still, indeed, was for Grandfather Frog had begun a story. "It happened a long time ago," said Grandfather Frog, "a very long time ago, in the days when the world was young. In those days, the snake family was a very important family." Yes, indeed, a very important family. Old Mr. Snake, who wasn't old then, was the head of the family. Certainly was smart. Yes, sir, old Mr. Snake certainly was smart. He was so smart that by and by people began to feel afraid to do business with him, for somehow no one ever got the best of him. He always wore a handsome suit, and he was extremely polite to everyone he met. "Politeness don't cost anything," old Mr. Snake used to say, and he certainly was free with his politeness and fine manners. My grandfather, I think, says that a lot. In a different way, though, but it's kind of his, like, motto. Interesting. What with his smart dress and his fine ways, people who had business with him couldn't think of anything but what a fine fellow Mr. Snake was. And all the time, old Mr. Snake would be cheating them right and left. My grandfather doesn't cheat people, though. Oh, there's the clock. All right, so Mr. Snake and all his family grew very rich. I think maybe just being polite was like something that he just grew up with. Like, you're just supposed to be polite to people. And the richer they grew, the more powerful they became. And the more powerful they became, the more polite old Mr. Snake was to everyone, rich and poor, high and low. He's kind of like, remember Sammy J? And how he was like thinking he was so much better than everybody, looking down on them. Mr. Snake's like doing the opposite, where he's just very polite, and yet he's being like sneaky behind his back. Like, you can't see that he's actually not being upright with everybody and truthful, but he's being coming across everybody as, but he's really not. Then one day, along came Old Mother Nature to see how things were getting along, and to hear of all the complaints. Of course, she saw right away how rich and powerful old Mr. Snake was, and his family had become, and how poor most of the other people had become. They all complained of hard times, and no one said a word against old Mr. Snake. Finally, old Mr. Snake came to pay his respects to Old Mother Nature, and you may be sure that he was dressed in his best suit and brought his finest manners. Old Mother Nature began to ask him questions about how he became so rich, and he and his family, and when all the others were crying hard times. Old Mr. Snake had an answer ready for every question, for his wit, means like his brain, his thinking, was quick, and his tongue was smooth and oily. Means it doesn't really mean that his tongue is oily. It means that like he can speak well, like he's able to say the words well. They come out of his mouth. Whatever the thing she asks, she doesn't like go It's all very like he just can say it off the tip of his tongue, unlike me right now. And all the time he was polite, oh, very polite. Not once did Old Mother Nature catch him with her sharp questions. Finally, along came someone to speak to Old Mother Nature, and she turned her back. Old Mr. Snake was so tickled, and to think how smart he had been in answering all her questions, that for a minute he forgot all his politeness. What do you think he did? Why, he ran out his tongue at Old Mother Nature behind her back. Now, with all his smartness, old Mr. Snake had not noticed a little pool of water in front of Old Mother Nature, into which she could see just what he was doing. Of course, she saw him thrust his tongue out. Impudence right there. What did she do? Why, from that day to this day, all the snake family have been compelled to run their tongues out at everyone they meet. So, of course, no one will have anything to do with such impudence, or being rude. And they haven't a friend in the world, concluded Grandfather Frog. So remember, these are all stories just to be fun. It's not really why snakes stick their tongues out at people. All right, last chapter today is called Peter Rabbit's First Snow. Peter Rabbit pinched himself. Yes, sir, that is just what Peter Rabbit did. He pinched himself. Then he rubbed his eyes, and after he pinched himself again. You see, Peter wanted to be sure, really sure, that he was awake, and he was finding it very hard to be sure. Where were the Green Meadows and the Green Forest? They had all disappeared, all in a single night. Peter looked this way and looked that way, and his big eyes grew bigger with wonder. He couldn't see a single thing that looked as it had looked the night before. He knew that he was in a safe retreat in the middle of the old briar patch, for right over his head were friendly old brambles under which Peter had sat and dreamed often and often. And yet they had changed. The old briar patch had become a new and beautiful place. The ground was covered with a carpet of white as soft as the down on Mrs. Quack's breast, like down as like feathers. And every smallest, teeniest, weeniest twig of the bushes growing among the brambles, and the brambles themselves were piled high with the same soft white stuff, until they bent over the ground and made the most wonderful caves and hiding places. It was a new world, a fairy world. Peter looked up in the blue, blue sky, and when he saw jolly, round, red Mr. Sun looking down and laughing at him, just as usual, he gave a great sigh. What do you think that white stuff is? It's snow. It is real, it is real. I wonder how it looks outside the old briar patch, he said, and started to find out. How soft that white carpet was. Peter's feet sank into it, and as he hopped along one of his private little paths, which now stretched before him like a little white ribbon. Every time his feet sank in, he had a funny feeling. You see, this was the first time he had ever felt anything quite so soft and cool. What is it, anyway? Said Peter, talking to himself out loud. Then into his head popped some stories which he had heard old Mrs. Rabbit tell when he was very, very small. Why, this must be snow, and winter has really come, cried Peter, suddenly sitting up very straight and clapping his hands. Then he kicked up his heels and scampered out on the Green Meadows, only they were not green anymore, but white, so beautifully white, and they sparkled so that Peter's eyes almost smarted from looking at them. Peter looked back at the old briar patch, and then, for the first time, he saw something new, his own tracks. There they were, the print of each foot as plain could be. It tickled Peter a lot to see them. He ran about to make more, running in circles and twisting and turning, and every few minutes sitting up to look at the funny patterns he had made in the snow. Then he kicked up his heels some more and did foolish things just because the world was so beautiful and he felt so happy. This reminds me, I went down to Texas one summer to work at a Boy Scout camp a few years back. And in Texas, it's so warm, they don't get snow very often. And they were telling me about this one winter that they'd gotten snow. And they were talking about like, oh, this is so cool. And it had only been, just a little bit, but not as much as we get up here. But It was the first time most of them had ever seen it, and so it was just so amazing because it was something that they'd never seen before. It's funny what you can take for granted and what you can think of as amazing. My, said Peter to himself, just think of all that Johnny Chuck is missing by sleeping all winter. Why, I wouldn't have missed this for anything. You see, this was Peter's first snow and first winter. He felt as if he were living in a new world, a wonderful new world, a great white world of which he knew nothing at all. It was all very delightful and very strange. Peter jumped up and kicked his heels for joy. There was an old lady who lived up in the clouds, a fussy old lady 'twas plain to be seen. She sputtered about and puttered around, a rubbing and scrubbing to keep her house clean. Along came a rogue by the name of Jack Frost. A rogue is like a bad guy. And found this old lady's bed made up with care. He opened the ticking, that's like the part that keeps all the fluffy stuff. And the feathers tossed out, and people below said, "That's snow in the air." That's funny. So he's making a story about how the snow is like feathers from someone's bed. So sang Peter Rabbit, as he scampered across the snowy green meadows to the green forest, which was also white. There was also the lone little path, as plain could be. Peter had to stop and stare at it because it was so plain. He remembered that in the summer, when the million little leaves had covered the bushes, the lone little path had sometimes been very hard to see. Then Peter reached the big hollow tree as Unc' Billy Possum lives, and there were no footprints in the snow around it. And so Peter knew that no one had been out that morning. He called and called, but no one answered. "Pooh!" exclaimed Peter. "Must be everyone asleep in there? Just think of what they're missing." Then he started off again, for he had just felt that he had got to look at everyone's wonderful caves of snow under the hemlock trees. It was great fun. Here he was, right in the midst of the green forest he knew so well. And yet, here on every side were strange white caves that he had never seen before, and odd mounds of sparkling white that puzzled Peter, until he found some familiar old stumps or logs hidden away underneath. So Peter made his funny tracks all through the green forest until finally he grew just a wee bit tired and sat down in one of the white caves to rest. How very still it is, thought Peter. Not a sound did he hear. He began to have a wee bit of lonely feeling. It was great fun, exploring this new world, but he wanted to talk it over with someone. Could it be that everybody but himself had gone to sleep for all winter? What a dreadful thought! But just as Peter began to be afraid that this was really true, he heard a voice way over near the Laughing Brook, and the voice cried, "Thief! Thief! Thief!" Then he heard another voice sputtering and scolding so fast that the words seemed to just fall over each other. Peter smiled. Sammy Jay and Chatterer the Red Squirrel wouldn't be happy, not even in such a beautiful world as this. Wouldn't without quarreling, said he as he hopped off in the direction of the Laughing Brook. Sammy Jay and Chatterer the Red Squirrel were calling each other names as fast as their tongues could go. It was good to hear them. Yes, sir, those angry voices actually sounded good to Peter Rabbit, and he laughed aloud and ran faster. You see, Peter had begun to think that he was the only one awake. Because it's like in that wonderful great white fairy world. This is why the quarreling voices of Sammy Jay and Chatterer sounded so good to him. Besides, he knew that their quarrels never amounted to anything, and that it is really their way of enjoying themselves. A pointed tongue has Sammy Jay, and Chatterer has a sharpened wits. Now tell us, pray, if you can see, how gentle speech with either fits. I guess that's a song that one of them was singing. It doesn't, and both Sammy and Chatterer the Red Squirrel say a great many things without really meaning it. When Peter came in sight, they stopped quarreling. Hello, Long Ears. I heard you were going to sleep all winter, shouted Sammy Jay. Peter grinned good-naturedly and made a face at Sammy Jay and Chatterer. Isn't it a great day? He cried. Great, replied Chatterer. Have you got your snowshoes on? What are snowshoes? Asked Peter, pricking up his ears. Go ask Mr. Grouse, said Chatterer. She has hers on this morning. Where is she? Asked Peter, preparing to start right away, for his curiosity would not let him sit still. Under the hemlocks up on the hill, replied Chatterer. What's your hurry? But Peter was already on his way up the hill. Pretty soon he noticed that some queer tracks in the snow. He'd never seen anything like them before. They looked just like the prints of Mrs. Quack's feet, which he had once seen in the mud on the edge of Farmer Brown's duck's pond. But Mrs. Quack never comes into the Green Forest, at least Peter, who had never seen her there. So Peter wondered and wondered whose tracks these could be, and followed them and found out, forgetting all about Mrs. Grouse and her snowshoes. Lipperty lipperty lip, scampered Peter Rabbit, following the queer tracks. Indeed, he didn't have eyes for anything else, and almost ran plump into Mrs. Grouse herself. Haven't you anything better to do than be running people down? Where are your ears, Peter Rabbit? Snapped Mrs. Grouse, ruffling her feathers. She's not very happy. I beg your pardon, said Peter. There's a stranger in the Green Forest making queer tracks, and... Peter stopped and stared. Mrs. Grouse had walked away from him, and she was making the queer tracks. Ha ha ha, laughed Mrs. Grouse. I made them myself with my new snowshoes. Peter looked at her feet. Sure enough, she was wearing snowshoes. They were feathers, of which grew out between her toes, and when she walked on the snow, she hardly sank in at all. My, I wish I had snowshoes, cried Peter. All right, so that was Peter and the First Snow. I think we have one more chapter left, and then I have another book to be reading with you guys. Well, I wanted to say that I really appreciate all of you guys' hard work. I noticed when I was looking at the ReadWorks this morning that a lot of you guys did ReadWorks. I think I had 9 and 10 people do each of them. So keep it up. I know it's getting tough outside, tougher without the outside being so nice. But you gotta stay focused. We still got 3 weeks left. It's tough for me too because I want to be outside reading or running or doing something in the sun, and I've got to be getting school stuff done. So it's tough for us all, but we got to push through this. So I'm proud of you guys, and I'll see you guys later.